In 1999, in a small European nation called Kosovo, NATO and Russia nearly went to war. This potentially devastating conflict was averted not by diplomacy but by insubordination on the part of the British, who flatly refused to follow American orders, the consequences of such orders too terrible to contemplate. Kosovo is a small Balkan nation, once part of Yugoslavia. Like the rest of the Balkans, it was riven by ethnic and religious tensions and animosities dating back centuries. This isn't a video about all that, but briefly, Kosovo's population was formed by two groups that loathed each other, Serbians and Albanians. Since the late 19th century, these factions had been in conflict over dominance in Kosovo, which itself developed from a mere province of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia into a semi-independent republic by the 1980s. With the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, the new Republic of Yugoslavia, essentially Serbia, determined that Kosovo would not go its own way, and Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic led a campaign to remove Albanians from all positions of influence in Kosovo, and over a period of 7 years, 350,000 would emigrate. At the same time, attempts were made to expand the Kosovan Serbian population to align the nation more closely culturally with Serbia proper. The Kosovan Albanians formed the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, largely armed from the dumps of the regular Albanian army following the collapse of that neighbouring country in 1997. Violence broke out in Kosovo. The KLA targeted Yugoslav authorities in Kosovo, while Serbian paramilitaries hit back at KLA sympathizers and political opponents. The United States began to seek a diplomatic solution. The United Nations had already intervened in earlier Yugoslav wars in the early 1990s. However, President Bill Clinton and NATO eventually decided to intervene militarily to end the bloodshed and to prevent Yugoslav forces from conducting the mass expulsion of Albanians from Kosovo.
Today, we and our 18 NATO allies agreed to do what we said we would do, what we must do to restore the peace. Our mission is clear: to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose, so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course, to deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo, and if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo. In short, if President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
In March 1999, NATO began a bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, with 1,000 aircraft flying from bases in Italy or aircraft carriers in the Adriatic Sea, plus of course cruise missile strikes from submarines. Over a period of 10 weeks, NATO aircraft flew over 38,000 combat missions under the NATO stated goal of Serbs out, peacekeepers in, refugees back. This meant forcing Yugoslav troops out of Kosovo to allow Albanian refugees to return. But NATO underestimated the will of President Milosevic to resist, and NATO operations were subsequently switched from Yugoslav air defences and infrastructure targets to targeting Yugoslav tanks, artillery and infantry units. One mistake made during this time was the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which killed 3 Chinese journalists and caused a major diplomatic incident with Beijing. The air campaign was not without loss for NATO. About 1,000 Yugoslav missiles were fired at NATO warplanes, and the Serbian Air Force was also extremely active. The United States lost an F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter and 2 F-16s. The Serbian Air Force lost 10 aircraft, including 5 MiG-29s in air-to-air combat. It became clear to politicians that to fully achieve NATO's goal, boots would have to be put on the ground. Banging the ground invasion drum the loudest was British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who eventually managed to persuade a reluctant President Clinton to approve this action. At the same time, Russia was working to try and get Milosevic to back down and withdraw his troops from Kosovo, Russia having traditional interests in the region and strong ties to Serbia. Milosevic hoped that President Boris Yeltsin would militarily support Yugoslavia against NATO, but that did not happen. Milosevic eventually agreed to NATO forces entering Kosovo, and to the steady withdrawal of his own troops, and to international mediation to settle the dispute once and for all. KFOR, the NATO-led peacekeeping force, was 30,000 strong, and was due to enter Kosovo on the 12th of June 1999. Its commander was British Lieutenant General Mike Jackson, and consisted of a British, a French and a German brigade advancing into Kosovo from the west, and Italian and US forces from the south. General Jackson, a paratrooper for much of his army career, had been nicknamed by his troops Darth Vader, owing to his temper and his deep voice. He also had a degree in Russian language and literature, which would prove useful over the next day. Jackson's superior in the chain of command was U.S. Admiral James O. Ellis, NATO Commander, Southern Europe, based in Naples. But Jackson's ultimate boss was U.S. General Wesley Clark, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. It would prove to be a difficult and tense relationship. But the day before the NATO force was due to enter Kosovo, it was discovered that Russian troops had already occupied the strategically vital Pristina airport in the Kosovan capital. The Russians, part of a peacekeeping unit in Bosnia, had driven to Pristina on the 11th of June. 30 Russian armoured fighting vehicles with about 250 heavily armed troops. They had hastily painted KFOR on their vehicles to give some authenticity to their rather unexpected mission. General Clark did not want the Russians in control in Pristina. He ordered British and French paratroopers to be flown forward by helicopters to seize the airport by force. This was a problem for two reasons. Firstly, KFOR was not supposed to enter Kosovo before the 12th of June, and the Royal Air Force and French helicopters might be shot at by withdrawing Yugoslav troops. And secondly, if they did indeed meet resistance, it would take the ground forces some time to reach them, as the Yugoslavian army was known to have prepared bridges and roads for demolition in their path. As the KFOR operation had not legally yet begun, the French government suddenly pulled its paratroopers out, leaving the British alone, sitting around their Chinooks all day, waiting for the signal to go, which never came. Instead, the next morning, 12th of June 1999, British paratroopers and a battalion of the Royal Gurkha Rifles were flown forward to begin securing the route for the advance of the British 4th Armoured Brigade. It was intended that the brigade's leading reconnaissance troop would then race ahead to Pristina. The reconnaissance unit was drawn from the Life Guards and commanded by Captain James Blunt, later a very famous musician. As the 4th Armoured Brigade advanced on Pristina, General Jackson flew to the Kosovan capital to confer with the Russian commander on the ground. He got along well with the Russian general, but NATO was aware that a much larger Russian force, including paratroopers, was being assembled at several air bases in the Russian Federation to be flown to Pristina. General Clark was determined not to allow this to happen. He conceived of a plan to block the runways at Pristina Airport with NATO helicopters. But poor weather conditions, with heavy rain, delayed this plan's execution. Clark arrived in person at General Jackson's headquarters at Skopje to confer with the British officer. The British briefed Clark. The small Russian unit was isolated at the airport and couldn't be easily reinforced. Anyway, it was due to Russian diplomacy that President Milosevic had agreed to allow the NATO KFOR operation to proceed. So doing anything to wind up and antagonize the Russians would be a counterproductive move. But Clark wasn't having any of this, and he ordered Jackson to block the runways. Jackson refused, famously telling him, quote, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you," end quote. The meeting became very heated, and Clark again ordered Jackson to block the runways, to which Jackson replied that it would perhaps be better to use British tanks from the 4th Armoured Brigade rather than helicopters, as he knew full well that the British government most probably would not permit such a move. The 4th Armoured Brigade had orders to isolate Pristina Airport, but not to interfere with the runways, and Captain Blunt, leading the reconnaissance force, later remarked that he himself would not have entangled his unit with the Russians. Jackson later told the BBC that obeying Clark's order would have led to possible armed conflict with Russian troops, saying it was not, quote, the right way to start off a relationship with the Russians, end quote. With the difficult situation of the British contingent refusing to follow Clark's order, the Americans changed tack and instead applied pressure on Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary not to allow Russian aircraft to pass through their airspace, which of course fouled up the Russian plan to reinforce Pristina airfield. Ultimately, Russian peacekeepers would remain in Kosovo, though not under NATO command. It remains a confrontation that could, if Clark's orders were followed by the British, have led to fighting between NATO and Russian forces, and perhaps to the kind of war everyone is talking about avoiding today with Russia over Ukraine. It's interesting to note, although General Jackson came in for a fair amount of high-level criticism in Washington, D.C. for his stand, General Clark was in fact removed early from his NATO command by the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. Thanks for watching, please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.